Hey kids, thanks for joining me in the garage again today. We're going to be doing a front wheel bearing replacement on the 99 4Runner. I'll show you how to take everything off, get all the bearings pressed out, press everything back on, and get it back on the truck. So stick with me here, like, subscribe, comment down below. See you in just a minute. All right, the first thing we're going to do is get all the parts laid out here so you know what you're going to need in order to do this job. So the spacer and the ABS tone ring are something you're not going to need to replace. So those come out and you'll be able to save those as long as you do the press work appropriately. You need new bearings, of course. So these are the front bearings. And then also you've got the seals that go on the front just behind the hub there. These will, they're basically dust seals, and so you'll want to make sure you got a new set of those because you'll have to tear these off in order to get the bearings out. Also, you'll need to get the rear seals as well. These seal up against the CV joint, and so you need to replace those as well. And then of course the bearing snap rings. These you'll end up taking out, and most likely when you're doing the press work, you'll probably end up kind of destroying those as well. One other thing that you don't need is I got the grease caps. I got new ones because my old ones are kind of torn up, and so I just wanted to replace them. So what we're going to do now, you can see I've got the driver's side knuckle all pulled out. We're going to go over there now, and I'll show you how we got this off the truck. All right, over at the truck here, the first thing we're going to need to do is get this cap off and get the nut off of the CV joint. That way, you know, as you start taking everything else apart, makes it a little easier to get this off. So you can see it's just kind of beat up a little bit. But typically, if you want to save these, you get kind of a screwdriver in here. Give it a little bit of a pound. You can kind of break this free depending on how rusty it is. Got your cotter pin here. And your little retainer. And so now we've got to get this nut off. Now, I might try real quick, 35 millimeter. See if I can get this off. Well, it doesn't look like it. So, second option here is we're gonna go get a wheel, put it on here, and that way we can kind of jam the wheel on the ground and then spin this thing off. So let's do that now. All right, now that we got the wheel on there, we can try this with a breaker bar. Now just wedge this over on the side here. There you go. Not too bad. If you had a partner or something that you was getting some help with, you could always have them go stomp on the brakes as well. So now we can start getting all these brake parts off. So you got this clip here that you're going to want to remove, and just again take a mini pry bar here and just hit it from underneath. There's a little lip. There you go. Then after this clip is done, you can pull the bracket off. You got a 12 millimeter there in the back. That gets that all nice and loose. And then you've got a 10 millimeter on the ABS sensor. Just pull that off there, right out of the little pocket that it fits in. So that gets that loose. So now you've got this bracket here that again holds the brake line and the ABS, or excuse me, just the ABS sensor. Want to get that off so that you don't rip it off when you pull the knuckle completely out. It's a 10 millimeter. There we go. And you just separate that, and then you can kind of get that out of the way. And then that's hooked to that lower bracket with kind of a little push-in plug, and you can just kind of pull that out. That way that is out of the way. So next thing to do is get the caliper off. All right, I've got that turned so you can see hopefully the mounting bolts right here to 17 millimeters. And then before you start this, you're going to want to get something to hang these calipers with. All right, those two bolts will then get the caliper removed. All right, so then we can hang it up here. There you go. Just want to make sure that it's not hanging on your brake line there. Then you can take the disc off, set that aside. And then next step, a couple of different ways you can do that. You can just pull the single nut on the lower ball joint off. I'm actually going to pull the 4 bolts that connect the knuckle to the lower ball joint because I'm going to be replacing those. And so if you do pull the 4 bolts off on the lower ball joint rather than the one big one that you then have to kind of press off, you're going to want to make sure to replace those, because those, depending on the year, I suppose, are torqued to their max, and so you know, they're really not a not a part that you can reuse, and so you'll definitely want to replace those. So I'm going to turn the steering wheel back straight here, and I'll hit those 4 on the bottom, and then show you how to also get the tie rod off as well. All right, and those bottom bolts are 14 millimeter. All right, next step, let's get the tie rod off, and I'm going to turn it a little bit here. Try to be careful not to mess up the caliper. That way you can kind of see how to get that off. All right, you can see now I've got that turned, and so first thing here on the tie rod, you got this cotter pin that you got to get pulled off. So that is a 19 millimeter that's on there, so we'll just zip that off. And so I've got, you know, just a kind of a, I guess this is a tie rod puller, and so we'll be using this to get that off. You just kind of slide it underneath here. I'm going to make sure to not pinch the boot because we're going to save this tie rod. Slide it underneath there. Get it tightened down by hand, and then we can just zip this off here. Just like that. Now the last thing to do is to get the top of the knuckle off here. So the top of the knuckle is going to be a lot different than on most people. I've got these SPC light racing control arms, And so, you know, these are really easy. You just have this 32 millimeter nut on the top here to get those off. So I've got a big 32 millimeter. Then a washer on the top as well. So now with that top part off, we just need to pound out the CV joint. We'll do that as we're kind of taking the knuckle off, and then that should pretty much do it for us here. And we'll be able to have this knuckle up on the table and then start getting these bearings and the hub and all that stuff pressed out. So let's do that real quick. Just blasted my hammer there. Kind of needed a new one anyway, it was all cracked, so garbage. And there we go, she's off. So now let's go put this on the table and we'll show you how to tear this apart, and then we'll get it over to the press and get everything pressed out. Over at the press here, I'll take a second to describe the setup on this. And so you've got two 4x4s that sit on, you know, the actual cross member of your press, with a 1/2 inch plate on top of those, and then 1 inch plates on top of those spanning that distance there. The reason you'll need that, if you look at the knuckle here, is you're going to be pressing the hub out of the bearing, and so you need that space. You'll essentially set those 1 inch plates on two of these bolts. There's one on each side over here and right here. And so when you set those down, then you press this hub down through. And so that's why you need this extra height here off of your cross member on your press. So let's set this on here. Just want to double check, make sure those are on there properly. And then the press sleeve that I'm going to use, this is a 50 millimeter outer diameter, and that just fits right inside the little spacer that's in the hub, or on the back side there, just perfectly. That way you'll be able to just press the hub right out of the bearing there. You're pressing right on the back of the hub, and so we'll just squeeze it right out. So and right before you start pressing, just take one more look, make sure everything's sitting where you need it, and then press away. That's a good sign. My hub is hitting on the bottom here. Let's just take a look and see where we're at. So here's that spacer. Looks as though the bearing kind of wants to come out with it as well. And so we'll just keep pressing here in order to give it a little more height. I'll put the Harbor Freight press plates underneath the 4x4s. Just need a little bit more, and now it's out of there. Now let's go back over to the bench there, and then we'll get off some of these seals, and then we can press the bearing out. All right. So next thing, of course, is to get these seals off, like we talked about. Best way to do this, I found, if you have a slide hammer, you could get in there and just pull this out. I don't have a slide hammer, so I'll just hammer these out here with a screwdriver in essence. Let me actually, it'll keep still for me. There you go. Then you can pull that ABS ring out as well. Now we got to flip it over, get the other seal off, and then we got to pull that clip out. All right. Now, as you can see, this bearing started coming out with the hub, and so I'm gonna hammer that bit back in a little bit. That way I can then get this clip out. All right. Let me grab my pliers here. Make sure that's loose. It is not. Yeah, that's not what I wanted to do there. This is going to be a bit of a chore now. As you can see, I broke the end off of it, which is not what I wanted to do. Help me understand. Let's do this. That'll at least make things a little easier to see here. The trick is that bearing is, pressed up against this snap ring, and so it's got it stuck in there, and so we got to get something in there to kind of free that up. I think what I'm going to need to do is go back over to the press here and just press that down a little bit, which should then free up this snap ring. So let me go do that real quick. I'm not going to show that, but I'll do that real quick and we'll get this snap ring off. All right, to get that pushed down in there properly, I have an old bearing here, and I just put that on top, put a plate on there, press that down. And now, as you can see, this here moves freely there, and so I should be able to get that popped out of there now. Get this set back up in the vise. Be able to just grab this with a pick, kind of pry it out a little bit. One of these sides anyway. I think the trick is to go to the press and press that down with the bearing first. That way you don't end up breaking off the little tips, and you could just grab this with your snap ring pliers, but obviously I did not do that. That was a farce. All right, as you saw, that was a bit of a farce. And so I wanted to go over the problems I ran into and then how I solved those. So there's actually two problems I ran into. So first, on the driver's side spindle, the bearing just came apart on me. And so you can see here, what I ended up doing is kind of chopping it, trying to chop it a little bit in half. That way I could get it off there. Ultimately, I think what helped with that is getting some heat on it. And you know, you can't really get a bearing splitter underneath that. You know, it's just too close here. And so that was the first problem I ran into. Second problem, as you saw, was getting this clip off. And so I want to show you exactly what I did here. You know, the clip, you know, when you're doing this, I think what you want to do is, if you've got an old bearing or even an old piece of pipe, when you press that hub out, you're effectively moving the bearing up against that snap ring. And so it makes it really hard to get it out with your snap ring pliers. And so what you need to do is push it back in so that that snap ring is then loose. So if you've got yourself an old bearing, you can just put that on there, throw it in the press that back down, the bearing back down, that way the snap ring is loose. Then you should be able to get it with your snap ring pliers. As you saw in my haste there, I ended up breaking off the ends of that snap ring so I could no longer get my snap ring pliers in there. And so what I did to kind of rectify that is I put a little groove here on one side, and then just a little notch on this side here. That way I could basically keep the snap ring from moving with the screwdriver, and then push this forward to get myself a gap with a pick. You could probably do this, if you put the groove a little deeper, you could probably do it with a screwdriver as well. That way you could then get that to spring, and then I was able to get a screwdriver in between the edge of the snap ring and the back of the spindle, or the back of the knuckle there. And so, you know, that was a little irritating. Next thing we need to do, now that we have that all apart, is we'll go ahead and we'll go back over to the press here. We'll press out this bearing and then get all the new parts put in. Back at the press here, I've got the same setup, and I've removed the backing plate, the you know, the brake dust shield, essentially, in order to do this pressing. We'll get this set back up as centered as close as possible, and then I've got an 82 millimeter press sleeve to get this. This just slides right down in there, and then to add a little extra height, got a little plate even that I'll set on top of that. And so yeah, just a matter of getting this all pressed out. Get this centered up a little bit. Bearing slowly coming out here. Boom. All right. So let's, I think before I start putting everything back together, I'm gonna go over, get this knuckle cleaned up a little bit, and then from there, we'll get everything pressed back in. We'll be right back. All right, as you can see, this spindle cleans up really nice. Just hit it with the wire wheel, WD-40. So now the next thing we need to do is get the bearing pressed in. So we have the bearing here. There's kind of two sides to this bearing. You can see there's one side that has kind of this plastic, and then the other side is metal here. And so that's the side, at least as we sit this on here, goes up. Basically, that's the side that'll go towards the wheel. And so the setup here for this is we've got our Harbor Freight press plates at the bottom, and then our two 1-inch plates here. That way these kind of the tongues where the lower ball joint go can sit over and kind of span that. That way we can then get this bearing centered. So we'll just set that down in there. Oh, one thing too before we get to pressing is, as you can kind of make out here, I've greased the inside there just to kind of get things going, make it a little smoother for pressing this in. And so, all right, we're ready to press. So we'll just set that down in there, about as straight as you can get it. And then on top of that, we'll set this press plate. And so this setup will get us most of the way. And then what we'll do is we'll use an old bearing to finish it off. All right, that gets us to the top there. And then we'll use this old bearing here to finish it off. That'll just sit right on the top there. We can put our plate back on. Get that nice and centered again. And we'll finish it up. There we go. As you can see, that old bearing we just need for that last little bit. So the next thing we need to do is go back over the bench and we'll get the snap ring put on and then that seal, and we can then put the hub back in. So let's go over the bench now. All right, now we can get this snap ring on. All right, so we've got it right here. Get these off, make it a little easier. The trick to getting these in is just kind of get it started a little bit here on one side, and then sometimes you can take a screwdriver, just like that. No need really for snap ring pliers, I suppose. All right, so next thing, to get this seal on, and again, you want to put a little bit of grease around the edge here. That'll just help that seal get on. That's probably enough. And then this is a type V oil seal. See that? And this you can just kind of try to get on there about as flat as you can. Then I'll take my brass drift. One thing that'll help is to get this in the vise. Make sure that's good and seated well. It looks like it is. We'll just go over it one more time. And then the next thing, before putting the hub back in, we want to make sure you get this brake shield put back on. Don't ask me how I know. These go on with a 12mm bolt. The ones I smashed with the press, though, actually take a 13mm now, it seems. All right, now it's back over to the press to get this hub in there, and we're also going to grease this up as well. And we'll put a little grease bearing here as well. Just kind of keeps things going in smoothly. All right, back over to the press. All right. So over here at the press, the way I've got this set up is just your standard Harbor Freight press plate, and then a 70 millimeter outer diameter press sleeve with the little press cap on there. And so, because what you want to do on this, you're going to be pressing that hub straight down in here. And so you don't really want to do that without basically supporting this bearing on the back side. And so what we're going to be doing, this little press sleeve here just fits right in. And so we'll be using that to support that bearing as we press in the hub. So let's just get that set down on here. Get it centered as well as you can. Then we'll stick the hub on here. And then our little square plate to actually press on. And then we're going to need to move this to get it centered. There we go. And so should just be able to start pressing. And so now with that sleeve underneath here, that's going to support that bearing, that center race on that bearing as we press this down. That way you don't rip the bearing apart, essentially. There we go. You'll feel that get tight on the bearing because it seats in on the hub. And once that seats in, it'll stop pressing in. So let's take a look. Yeah, so you can see that sleeve is just wide enough where the hub can essentially kind of get through it and then not interfere, but then at the same time, you're supporting that bearing in there. Excellent. All right, let's go back to the bench and then we'll get the seal on the rear all put together and the ABS sensor and a little spacer, and we'll be good to go. Now to get all those seals on, we'll go ahead and put it back in the vise here. Doesn't have to be super tight. First thing we'll drop in here is this ABS tone ring here. We'll just drop right in. And then spacer right on top of that. And then we got to get this seal on. So this is the seal that seals up against your CV axle. And then this seal, the protruding portion goes down. And so let's put a little bit of grease on the edge here. Help this slide in a little bit. And just take this, press it down in there a little bit. We'll take our brass drift and hammer again, kind of get it fully seated. All right, just take a look around the edge there. That looks perfect. Got the seals on, got the hub pressed in, new bearing. So we're ready to rock. Go get this put back on the truck here. So we'll want to get this set up in there, and then we'll get the upper ball joint placed, and then, have the lower ball joint set in. So I've got the nut and washer for the top. We'll need to kind of get the CV in at the same time here. All right, got my little factory sheet here. And so one important thing on these lower ball joints, you're going to want to use some blue Loctite, and mine's a 99. And so if you look at this front lower ball joint on the OEM, you'll see here it says that you torque them at 37 foot-pounds. But this is for a 2002 4Runner, this OEM factory service manual, and those 2002 4Runners had the lower ball joint dust cover in a different type of bolt. And so it shows 37 on here, but since I don't have this dust cover and I have a different type of bolt, these should actually be torqued to 59 foot-pounds. So I've got new bolts for this, and so let's get those Loctited and we'll get them screwed in. I'm actually just going to start by putting a couple in. Then once I've got the tie rod on, I'll go through the torque process here. This is torqued to 67 foot-pounds. I believe that's a 19 millimeter. All right, we are set to 67 foot-pounds. Here we are. Of course, we got a cotter pin. It never lines up, so you always want to keep tightening it until that cotter pin lines up. Here we are, cutter pins in, tie rod's all good. So now we can start getting the lower ball joint bolts all done. So as you can see, these are flange bolts as opposed to a bolt with a washer. And so this is the part number for the, it would be, I suppose, 99 and lower years where you don't have the dust cover on the lower ball joint. And so these, again, you need to torque to 59 foot-pounds, not to the recommend, you know, the service manual that's going around as a 2002. And so that one recommends 37 foot-pounds, and that's wrong for these type of bolts. So you want to make sure these are torqued to 59. So we got the torque wrench set to 59 foot-pounds. All right, all four of those are installed with Loctite, blue Loctite, and torqued to 59 foot-pounds. So we can move on to the next thing, which is going to be the brake rotor. We'll get that on, and then we can get the caliper back on. There we are. Put a couple of lug nuts on here. Make my life a little bit easier. And then I think what I'll do, these have to be torqued to 90 foot-pounds. I think what I'll do is go ahead and turn the wheel again in order to get this position where I can get my torque wrench in there. And like I said, those will be 90 foot-pounds is what they're looking for. So I'll set the old torque wrench to 90. There we are. And so the next thing is going to be, we'll go ahead, we'll get this top nut here. This is a 32. This will be a little different. The factory nut actually gets torqued, I believe, to 80 foot-pounds. But this one here, these SPC light racing ones, get torqued to 85. So we'll go ahead and we'll move this down to 85 here. There we go. And then we can get the ABS sensor back in. And so that is just your standard 10 millimeter. And so let me get a long extension here. There we go. Now the next thing is going to be this brake line. So there's this, pulled up here, little bracket here. And so the way you want to do this, you know, the bracket screws in to a bolt back behind here. And now the problem is, if you screw this in there, you won't get the brake line on. So the trick is to clip the brake line in first and then bolt down the bracket. So, because this bracket hole where the brake line goes in is oblong, and so it'll fit on this brake line only a certain way. And then you can take your clip, put that in there, then we can put the brake line bracket in. This is a 12 millimeter bolt. And then from there, it's on the back side, but the ABS sensor will clip down the bottom of that bracket. And then up higher here, we've got the 10 millimeter bolt for the clip that holds the ABS line up higher here. No problem. There, so that's all secure. So the next thing we got to do is get the nut onto the CV joint, and that's 174 foot-pounds. So we're going to get this straightened back out again, and then we'll get that on there. All right, now that that's straightened out, we're just going to start out, we'll get this rattle gun on here. All right, that'll get it somewhat on there. Now we'll need to go in, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the tire on, just like we took it off. We'll jam that tire and then crank this down to 174 foot-pounds. Never understood how those NASCAR people did this so fast. F1 guys. Jeez. All right. I don't think that's going anywhere. So we're just gonna jamaroo that up front here. $174 foot-pounds. Click. Whew. Now we got to put that little castle nut, I guess, retainer nut in there. And then we got to get the cotter pin in behind that. And just get this wrapped around the wires here. Then the last thing is the cap, and I've got a new cap here. So let me grip my brass drift. All right, we're all buttoned up here. Everything's torqued, got all the cotter pins on, and I think it's time to put the wheels back on, finish up this job. All right, got the wheels torqued there on the front and got everything locked up and ready to go. So, you know, a couple of things that I learned on this job is you want to make sure after you've pressed the hub out and before you try to remove that retaining ring, that you go ahead and flip it over on the press that bearing down a little bit. That way it gives that retaining ring little bit of room to move and make it a lot easier to pull it out. You won't have to go through the trouble that I did. And so one of the things I do want to tell you on this job, I wouldn't have been able to do this job if I didn't already know how to do it and seen somebody do it. And so I want to give a shout out to Timmy the Tool Man. I'll put a link up here. He's done this job and I learned from him essentially. I've got the factory service manual and you can follow that. But me, I'm the type of person who learns from watching somebody. And so I really appreciate all he's done. He did that on his manual hub swap, kind of went through all the procedures and the setup of the press. And so I really appreciate his channel. If you haven't seen his channel, you should check it out. If you like 4Runners, he does pretty much everything you could ever need on a 4Runner. They're working on an engine swap right now. And so I'm not sure what part is out now that, as I'm wrapping up and editing this video. But it's really worth a watch. You can see a lot of the stuff on his channel that I've also done on my truck just by watching what he does. So I appreciate you watching. I hope you liked what you saw. Hit that thumbs up if you did. If you're here for the first time, consider subscribing. You can always follow me on Instagram @WeekendWrenchTurner. Thanks for watching. Keep on wrenching.